The galaxy was old, older than most species could properly imagine. It had seen stars born and die, had watched civilizations rise from nothing and collapse into dust, and had quietly kept its secrets the way only something truly ancient could. Not by hiding them, but by simply waiting for someone to ask the right question. Soren Kaas had always asked too many questions. His people, the Veth, considered this a mild character flaw. Not dangerous, not shameful, she's just slightly inconvenient, the way a leaking pipe is inconvenient. You notice it, you sigh, you work around it. His teachers had noted it. His parents had tried to correct it. His superiors at the Galactic Conclave had learned eventually to simply hand him assignments where curiosity was at least partially useful. He was 26 cycles old, which made him young by Veth standards and practically ancient by the standards of some of the shorter-lived species who sat on the conclave floor. He had pale gray skin, large dark eyes that caught light the way polished stone catches light, and a habit of tilting his head to the left when something did not make sense to him. On this particular morning, his head was tilted very far to the left. He was sitting in the navigation room of the diplomatic vessel Eternal Accord, and he was staring at a star map. The Eternal Accord was a beautiful ship. It had been built 3 centuries ago by the Kith shipwrights as a gesture of galactic unity, a all-smooth white hull and long sweeping lines, with rooms decorated in the styles of a dozen different species. It carried ambassadors, diplomats, and aides from across the conclave to and from the annual summit, which was held at a rotating location each cycle. This cycle, the summit was being held at Varath Station, a neutral platform hanging in empty space between 3 different star systems. Soren Kaas was not an ambassador. He was a junior aide, which meant he carried documents, organized schedules, fetched refreshments, and was generally expected to be invisible. He had been doing all of these things competently for 2 cycles now. He was good at his job. The invisibility part, however, he sometimes struggled with. He had come to the navigation room because the route on the central screen had caught his eye as he passed the open doorway. He had stopped, he had looked, and then he had stepped inside because the route on the screen had a small section of it that seemed, to his eye, slightly wrong. The Eternal Accord was taking a long arc around a particular region of space, a very long arc, the kind of arc that added several extra days to the journey. Soren Kaas had looked at the direct route, the obvious, logical, straight line between their current position and Varath Station, and could not understand why they were not taking it. He had pulled up the navigation interface and simply started exploring. He had not touched anything. He had only looked. But what he found as he looked was a pattern that did not make sense. Every route in the ship's memory, every pre-plotted course for every destination within a certain region of the galaxy, curved around the same area. It was not marked on the official charts as a hazard zone. There were no noted anomalies, no recorded debris fields, no warning flags. It was just empty space, a wide region of stars and systems that every charted route in the Eternal Accord's navigation database carefully, consistently avoided. Soren Kaas tilted his head. He did what any curious person would do. He pulled up the region and looked at it directly. It was large, much larger than he had initially realized. It covered dozens of star systems, hundreds of inhabited worlds, an enormous sweep of the galaxy's inner arm. It had a name, though the name was not prominently displayed. It appeared only in small text in a corner of the chart, as if whoever had labeled it had not wanted to draw attention to it. When the label said human space, Soren Kaas had heard of humans. Every species had, in the vague and distant way that one hears of something without ever quite learning the details. They existed in the background of galactic knowledge the way certain old stories exist. Everyone knows the title. No one can quite tell you what happens in them. He had never met one. He was not sure anyone he knew personally had met one, or he could not recall a single lesson from his schooling that had focused on them specifically. He had, however, heard the phrase that every young Veth child eventually heard from an older relative or a tired teacher when asking one question too many about something they should not be pursuing. You do not go there. He had always assumed it meant something metaphorical, a lesson about certain dangerous neighborhoods of space perhaps, radiation zones, contested territories. the kind of place pirates operated from. He looked at the navigation interface again. He looked at the direct route to Vareth Station. He looked at the small section of it that clipped, just barely, the outer edge of the region marked human space. He did not touch anything. He only looked. But behind him, the door slid open, and Navigator Peliris walked in. A thin Keth woman with silver markings along her neck, and the expression of someone who had seen a child about to touch a hot stove. She crossed the room in 3 quick strides and closed the navigation display so fast that Soren Koss actually stepped back. The silence that followed was long and specific. It was the kind of silence that carries weight. "I was only looking," Soren Koss said. Peliris did not answer immediately. She stood very still, looking at the now blank screen. And her expression was something Soren Koss could not immediately name. It was not anger. It was not irritation. It was something older and quieter than both of those things. "Go back to your duties," she said. "I didn't change anything. I was curious about the route." "Go back to your duties, Aide Soren Koss." He went, but he looked back once as he left, and what he saw stopped him for just a moment in the doorway. Peliris was still standing at the navigation console, is still looking at the blank screen, and her hands were pressed flat against the surface of the console. Not gripping it, just pressing, as if she needed to feel something solid. Her eyes were closed. Soren Koss went back to his duties, but the question stayed with him, the way questions always stayed with him, sitting behind his eyes, waiting. The summit began 3 days later. The Eternal Accord docked at Vareth Station alongside 11 other diplomatic vessels. And the great hall of the station filled with the noise and color of 17 different species, attempting, with varying degrees of success, to be polite to each other. Soren Koss moved through the crowds with his datapad and his schedule, invisible in the way that junior aides are invisible, present enough to be useful, unimportant enough to be ignored. He delivered documents. He confirmed meeting times. He fetched a specific type of mineral water for the Dreth ambassador, who would drink nothing else, and who expressed his thanks in the form of a grunt that Soren Koss had learned, after 2 cycles, to interpret as genuine appreciation. In the evenings, when the official sessions ended and the ambassadors retired to their private quarters, Soren Koss sat in the common room and read. He had found in the station's public archive a collection of old trade route records, not historical records, not academic papers, just practical, boring documents about shipping lanes and travel times. He read them the way another person might read a mystery story, looking for patterns, looking for the thing that did not fit. He found it everywhere. Every shipping lane, every trade route, every recorded journey between major systems in the inner arm of the galaxy bent around the same region. Some of them bent so dramatically that the detour added weeks to journeys that should have taken days. There was no official explanation in any of the documents. The routes simply curved. They had always curved. The records went back centuries and the curve was there in all of them, consistent and unquestioned. The way a scar is consistent. You stop noticing it after a while. He started asking questions. He was careful about it. He did not ask the ambassadors, who would either not answer or would have him reassigned. He asked the other junior aides, the clerks, the station workers. One he asked in the way that seemed casual, conversational, as if he was simply making small talk. Most people said they did not know what he was talking about. Some of them said it in ways that made it clear they did know exactly what he was talking about and had decided not to discuss it. A few of them, the older ones, the ones who had worked in galactic politics for a long time, got a look in their eyes that Soren Koss was starting to recognize. That same quiet, closed-off expression that Navigator Peliris had worn. Not fear exactly, something more like the memory of fear. Something that had been carried for so long it had become part of the furniture of the mind. On the 4th evening of the summit, he found himself in the station's small public garden, a room with real soil and real plants brought from a dozen worlds, which always smelled strange because of it. Sitting beside the Yearn ambassador's personal secretary, a very old Yearn named Thesis, who smelled of spiced tea and had been working in galactic diplomacy for longer than Soren Koss had been alive. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Thesis was one of those people who did not need to fill silence with words, which Soren Koss appreciated. "Can I ask you something?" Soren Koss said eventually. "You can ask," Thesis said, which was not the same as saying he would answer. "Human space," Soren Koss said. "And why does everyone go around it?" Thesis was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at a small blue plant near his feet, a trailing thing with thin leaves that moved slightly in the recycled air. "How old are you?" Thesis said. 26 cycles. Thesis was quiet again. "When I was young," he said at last, "my grandmother told me a story. She said that once, a very long time ago, the Yearn had sent a survey ship into that region, a small ship, a scientific vessel. There were 7 crew members." Soren Koss waited. "The ship came back," Thesis said. "The crew was fine, healthy, unharmed." He paused. "But they would not talk about what they had seen, any of them. For the rest of their lives, they would not speak about it. They would leave the room if it was brought up. One of them, the captain, burned all of his personal logs from that journey." "What did they see?" Thesis picked up the blue plant and set it on his knee, looking at it. "No one knows," he said. That is the point of the story, I think." He set the plant back down. "You do not go there, young Soren Koss. This is not a rule that anyone made. It is a rule that simply is. The same way that you do not put your hand into fire. You do not need a reason written down somewhere. You simply do not do it." Soren Koss looked at the plant too. "But the crew came back fine," he said. "They came back silent," Thesis said. "That is not the same as fine." He stood up slowly, much with the careful movements of someone whose joints had begun to complain, and walked out of the garden without another word. Soren Koss sat alone with the plants and the strange mixed smell of a dozen different worlds, and his head tilted slowly to the left. On the last day of the summit, something happened that made every conversation he had been having feel suddenly very small. He was crossing the main corridor of Verith Station, a wide, high-ceilinged hall with transparent panels in the roof that showed the stars outside, when he heard a commotion near the communications hub at the far end. Not a loud commotion, not shouting or alarms. Something quieter and more unsettling, the sound of a large number of people going very still all at once. He moved toward it, because he always moved toward things rather than away from them. In the communications hub, a cluster of diplomats and aides and station workers were standing around the main display. On the screen was a map, a star chart, and on the chart was a single moving signal, a ship's beacon, and the ship's beacon was crossing a line that every person in the room recognized. A Dreth vessel, a raider, by the look of the beacon's class signature. Moving through the outer edge of human space. No one spoke. Soren Koss stood at the edge of the group and watched the faces of the people around him. He saw the Keth ambassador, who was one of the most composed beings he had ever observed, standing with his arms at his sides and his jaw very tight. He saw 3 different species representatives who had never, in his experience, agreed on anything, all standing close together as if instinctively seeking company. He saw Navigator Pel Iris near the back of the room, and her face was the same as it had been 3 days ago in the navigation room of the Eternal Accord. Not afraid. Something older than afraid. The beacon moved. It crossed the line. It went deeper. The room watched. The beacon moved, and then it disappeared. The room stayed silent for a very long time after that. Soren Koss stood among them, watching the blank space on the chart where the beacon had been, and felt something shift inside him. Not fear. He could not quite reach fear yet, because he did not know enough to be afraid of the right things. What he felt was something else. The particular sensation of standing at the edge of something very large and very deep, and looking down, and understanding for the first time that you are standing at an edge. He looked around at the faces of people who had known about that edge for their entire lives, who had been raised knowing about it, who had built their careers and their trade routes and their political systems around it, carefully, without ever looking at it directly. He looked at the blank space on the chart. He thought about 7 Yearn scientists who had come back silent. He thought about a galaxy of species, ancient and advanced and powerful, all quietly, carefully, consistently going around the same piece of space for centuries, without anyone ever writing down a proper reason why. He thought about the word that was never quite used but always present, The word that hid inside phrases like, "You do not go there," and looks like the one Thesis had given the blue plant. As if looking at something small and familiar was easier than looking at the larger thing behind it. The word was fear, and standing in that room, watching people who governed star systems and commanded fleets standing close together like children in the dark, Soren Koss understood for the first time that whatever was inside that region of space was not a bedtime story. It was not a metaphor. It was not a scar so old that no one remembered the wound. It was real, and somewhere inside it, a Dreth Raider's beacon had just gone dark. His head tilted to the left. His hands were very steady. He was going to find out what was in there. He did not know yet that the answer would not be what anyone expected. He did not know that the fear which had kept an entire galaxy walking in long, careful arcs for centuries, Osh was built on something that no species had quite managed to look at straight. He did not know that the truth behind the silence was stranger and more humbling than any monster could have been. But he was going to find out. He always did. The beacon stayed dark for 3 days. 3 days was not a long time in the life of the galaxy. Stars burned for billions of years. Civilizations rose over centuries. Political disputes between species sometimes ran for generations before anyone bothered to resolve them. 3 days was barely a breath, but in those 3 days, the silence from inside human space sat over the galactic community like a held breath. People who had never cared about a Dreth Raider in their lives found themselves checking the long-range sensor reports. The conclave, which had been in its closing sessions and preparing for departure, quietly extended the summit by 2 days with no official explanation. Everyone knew why. No one said it out loud. Soren Koss barely slept. He had, in those 3 days, learned more about the missing Dreth vessel than he had any official reason to know. He had used his access as a summit aide, which was technically only supposed to allow him into meeting rooms and catering schedules, to quietly wander into conversations and listening to people who forgot he was there. He was good at that. He had been good at it since childhood. The ship was called the Hard Luck, which Soren Koss thought was either the most honest name for a Dreth Raider or the most ironic one. She was a mid-sized vessel, old, with a crew of 9. Her captain was a Dreth named Vorak, who had a history of small-scale piracy in the outer systems. Nothing serious enough to bring the Conclave's enforcement fleets down on him, just enough to keep himself and his crew alive. She had been traveling through the boundary region between galactic open space and human space when she crossed the line. Whether she had crossed it by accident or by desperate necessity, fuel running low, engines failing, some emergency forcing the closest available route, no one knew for certain. The Dreth ambassador at the summit, a heavyset being named Garrow, who wore his military decorations even at diplomatic events, had gone very quiet when the beacon disappeared. He had not made any public statements. He had not demanded a rescue mission. He had, according to the aide who handled his schedule, canceled all his remaining appointments and spent the next 2 days alone in his quarters. That told Soren Koss everything he needed to know about what Dreth military leadership thought the Hard Luck's chances were. On the morning of the second day, a few of the more aggressive voices in the Conclave's lower chambers had begun talking about a retrieval operation. However, they did not get far. The elder ambassadors, as the Keth, the Yearn, the old Thessal representatives who had been part of galactic politics for longer than most species had been spacefaring, shut the conversation down with a speed and a unity that was itself remarkable. These were beings who disagreed on nearly everything. They agreed on this without hesitation. No one was going into human space. Not for 9 Dreth pirates, not for anyone. Soren Koss sat in the common room on the evening of the second day and watched the elder ambassadors and tried to understand them. They were not cruel beings. The Keth ambassador, Leth Naren, had spent 40 years working on refugee resettlement programs. The Yearn representative, Old Thessis's direct superior, had brokered 3 separate peace agreements in his career. These were not beings who left people to die casually, and they left people to die when the alternative was something they considered worse. That told Soren Koss something too. He sat with that thought and turned it over in his mind, the way he turned all his thoughts over, looking at them from different angles. What was worse than 9 people dying? What could be bad enough that beings of good conscience would choose it without hesitation? The only answers he could think of were something very large, or something very unknown, or both. When he was still sitting with those thoughts when the alert came, the beacon reappeared on the morning of the third day. Soren Koss was in the communications hub when it happened. He had taken to spending his free hours there, on the pretense of updating the conclave's travel records, and the station workers had gotten used to him being in the corner with his datapad. When the signal appeared on the main chart, he was close enough to see it before anyone else reacted. When the hard luck had come out the other side, not from where she had gone in, she had entered human space through the near boundary, the edge closest to galactic open space. She reappeared at the far boundary, the deep boundary, the far interior edge, thousands of light years away. She had traveled in 3 days, a distance that should have taken weeks. She had traveled deeper into human space than any recorded vessel in living memory, and come out the other side. And she was broadcasting. Ooh, the room filled up fast. In less than 10 minutes, every senior diplomat on Verith Station was in or around the communications hub, and the signal was being routed through the main speakers so that everyone could hear. Soren Koss stood very still in his corner and listened, because nobody was asking him to leave. The voice that came through the speakers was Vorax. Soren Koss had never heard it before, but there was a quality to it that he recognized immediately. Because he had been listening for that quality for 3 days. It was the voice of someone who had seen something they did not have words for yet, not a panicked voice, not a traumatized voice, not even a frightened voice exactly. It was a stunned voice, deeply, completely stunned. The voice of someone who had built an entire internal picture of the world and then been shown, gently and thoroughly, that the picture was wrong. The transmission was looping. It had been looping for some time before they picked it up, which meant Vorak had been broadcasting it continuously since the moment the hard luck cleared the boundary. He was not stopping to think about what he was saying. He had already thought about it. He was just saying it over and over, because perhaps saying it over and over was the only way to start believing it. "We went in," Vorak's voice said. "We had no choice. Drive failure. We needed the closest route. We crossed the line. Hey, we knew what we were doing. We accepted it." A pause. "They found us within minutes. Dozens of ships. Not like anything I've seen. Big, very big. They surrounded us completely. We had no weapons that would have mattered, so we didn't try. We just waited." Another pause, longer this time. "They hailed us. On our frequency. They knew our frequency. They spoke Dreth. Not well, not perfectly, but enough. They asked why we had come. We told them. Drive failure, emergency, we needed passage through. And we offered everything we had, cargo, credits, the ship itself if they wanted it." The room was absolutely silent. Soren Koss could hear the ventilation system humming overhead. "They said no," Vorak's voice continued. "They said they didn't want our things. They asked about our drive. What was wrong with it? Our engineer explained. One of their ships came alongside us. A technician came aboard. She fixed the drive in 4 hours. She didn't ask for anything. She just fixed it." A very long pause. "Then they gave us a route, a safe route all the way through. They told us which systems to avoid, which lanes were clear. They guided us the whole way. Their ship stayed close but not threatening. When we got to the far boundary, their lead ship hailed us again." The voice cracked slightly, not breaking, just bending. "The captain of their lead ship. I don't know her rank, I don't know her name. She said, 'Travel safely, and next time, I will send a message first. We would have come to you.'" The transmission looped back to the beginning and started again. No one in the communications hub spoke for a long time. Soren Koss watched the room. He watched the elder ambassadors. He watched Leth Naren, who was standing with his arms crossed and his eyes on the floor, with the expression of someone doing complicated arithmetic in their head. He watched the Dreth ambassador Garo, somebody who had stopped not speaking and was now standing near the speakers with an expression that Soren Koss could only describe as undone. As if something inside him had been built on a foundation that had just quietly dissolved. He watched Thesis, who was standing near the back of the room and who, when he felt Soren Koss looking at him, met his eyes for a brief moment. Thesis looked tired, not surprised, just very, very tired. The transmission spread faster than the conclave could contain it, because the conclave, it turned out, did not move as fast as a looping broadcast on an open frequency. By the time the senior staff had a meeting about controlling the information, the signal had already been picked up by a dozen relay stations across the region and passed along by every civilian operator who had happened to be monitoring that frequency, which was many because everyone had been monitoring everything for 3 days. Within a standard day, the galaxy knew. Not all at once, but in pieces. The way large things always spread, first to the people who were paying attention, then to their contacts, then outward in rings like a stone dropped in water. Soren Koss tracked it the best he could from Vareth Station. He read the public boards, the civilian news relays, the diplomatic dispatches that came through the station's communication system. He built a picture from the pieces. The reactions were varied. On some worlds, the news was met with disbelief. The story was too clean, too strange. 9 pirates had gone into the most feared region in the galaxy and come out with their drive fixed and a polite farewell ringing in their ears. It sounded like a dream. It sounded like a story someone made up to make themselves feel better. On other worlds, the reaction was not disbelief, but something more unsettling, a kind of retroactive shame. If humans had simply fixed a broken drive and said travel safely, then what exactly? Had 3 centuries of careful avoidance been built on? What had all those long-arcing trade routes been about? What had the silence meant? In the conclave chambers, the reaction was controlled and careful on the surface, and something much more volatile underneath. Soren Koss sat in on 3 meetings he was not officially invited to by the simple method of being very still in a corner with a data pad. In those meetings, he heard the elder ambassadors speak in the formal, measured language of people who were managing a situation. They talked about information verification. They talked about the need for calm. They talked about the importance of not drawing conclusions from a single incident. What they did not talk about in any meeting was the obvious question. If the hard luck had come out intact, if her crew was fine, if they had been helped, then what had everyone been afraid of? No one asked it. Soren Koss noticed that. One of the most powerful diplomats in the galaxy, in meeting after meeting, carefully and collectively, did not ask the most obvious question in the room. That, more than anything, told him the question had an answer, and that the answer was something the people in those rooms already knew. The hard luck docked at a neutral station near the outer boundary 4 days after her reappearance. Vorak and his crew were met by medical teams, debrief officers. In Iran, though this was not announced publicly, representatives from 3 of the conclave's elder nations who arrived on unmarked ships. Soren Koss was not there. He had no way to get there and no authority to demand access even if he had. But he had, by this point, developed a network of sources inside the station's communication channels that would have impressed his superiors if they had known about it. He got the debrief summary 2 days after it was filed. It said largely what the transmission had already said. The crew was healthy, no physical harm, no psychological breaks, no trauma markers beyond what you would expect from an emergency situation. Vorak had confirmed the account in person, as had each of his crew members separately. Their stories matched completely, not in a suspicious way, but in the way that genuine experiences match when 9 people all live through the same thing. There was one detail in the debrief that had not been in the transmission. One small thing that the debrief officer had noted almost as an aside, as if they were not sure what to make of it. Vorak had said in his in-person interview that during the 4 hours while the human technician was fixing the drive, several other members of the human escort had come alongside the hard luck in small craft and passed boxes through the airlock. Food mostly, some medical supplies. A few items that appeared to be comforts. Good quality blankets, a kind of drink that turned out to be a warm, sweet beverage that none of the Dreth crew had ever tasted before. No one had asked for these things, they had simply been given. When Vorak's engineer had tried to refuse, out of pride or stubbornness or simple disbelief, the human who handed the boxes through had smiled. Vorak had described the smile in some detail. He had been asked to describe it because the debrief officer had noticed that he mentioned it twice unprompted. He said it was the smile of someone who was not surprised by the refusal, who had expected it, who was offering anyway, not because they expected acceptance, but because offering was simply what they did. Soren Koss read this detail and sat very still with it for a long time. He thought about a galaxy that had been afraid of this for 300 years. He thought about trade routes that curved for weeks out of their way. He thought about 7 Yearn scientists who had come home silent, and he wondered for the first time whether they had been silent from terror or from something else entirely. Something that also had no words but for different reasons. He thought about the elder ambassadors in their meetings, carefully not asking the obvious question. He thought about Thesis's tired eyes, and he thought, they know something. Not just that humans were not the monsters the silence had implied, something more specific than that. Something they had known for a long time and had chosen, carefully and consistently, not to share. He put down the debrief summary. He had not come this far by being patient, but he was going to need to be patient now, because what he needed was not going to be found in navigation databases or shipping records or the overheard conversations of mid-level diplomats. What he needed was in the deep archives, the sealed records, the documents that the elder nations kept behind permissions that a junior conclave aide had absolutely no right to access. He was going to access them anyway. He did not think of this as a plan so much as an inevitability. The question had been inside him since he had stood in the navigation room of the Eternal Accord and looked at the region marked human space. The question had been growing since then, fed by Thesis's tired eyes and Pel Iris's pressed palms and an undone Dreth ambassador and a looping transmission that a galaxy had heard and understood wrong because they had been carrying the wrong story for too long. He was going to find the right story. He picked up his data pad. He started making notes. Outside the small window of his quarters, the stars were sharp and cold and very, very old. Somewhere far beyond what he could see, in a region of space that every chart curved around, something patient was waiting. Something that fixed broken drives and gave out blankets and smiled.